Welcome to this episode of the Good for America podcast. I'm your host, former Congressman Bob Good, former chair of the House Freedom Caucus. I want to remind you to subscribe to the podcast, follow me on social media at Rep Bob Good, rate the show, and be sure to share it with your friends. The topic for today is life, the issue that most Republicans don't want to talk about. Life, the issue that most Republicans don't want to talk about. We're completing our second month of this podcast since we launched around the 1st of June. And I've been wanting to talk about the life issue, particularly ever since the Dobbs anniversary, the very important decision, the life-altering decision, literally, that overturned Roe v. Wade and returned that issue back to the people and the people's representatives. We spend a lot of time on this podcast talking about issues that are uncomfortable to most elected Republicans or Republican candidates, and none more so than today for the party, the Republican Party, that I think it really wants this issue just to go away, would like the life issue, the abortion issue to go away. So today's topic is one that the Republican Party really hasn't wanted to talk about or to discuss since the famous Dobbs decision 3 years ago last month, June 24 of 2022. There was the famous Dobbs decision, again, that overturned Roe v. Wade, the monumental, infamous decision from 1973, the Roe v. Wade decision that said that there was a constitutional right to an abortion, obviously contrary to the Constitution, as the Supreme Court correctly ruled 3 years ago. But the Roe decision back in 1973 said that women have a right to an abortion, a constitutional right to an abortion, and it greatly limited the ability of legislative bodies, the people's representative at the state and the federal level, to limit abortion because the Supreme Court again ruled that there was some phantom, mysterious, invisible right to an abortion enshrined in the Constitution. It was just a horrible decision, a 7-2 decision back in January of 1973. And it's the only decision in the history of the country, the only Supreme Court decision in the history of the country that cost over 60 million lives. But since then, and the Dobbs decision 3 years ago, overturning Roe, June 24 again of 2022, I call it the Great Departure, where Republicans have wanted to run away from the life issue, run away from the abortion issue out of fear. Now that they have the responsibility and the ability to legislate on life, so many Republicans, particularly at the federal level, have wanted to just escape the issue, not talk about the issue, avoid the issue. Many of my friends in D.C. became what I call hyper-federalists. All of a sudden, they saw abortion as one of those issues that should be greatly limited at the federal level and an issue strictly to the states. Unfortunately, President Trump, then candidate Trump 3 years ago, really led the Great Departure when he misrepresented, whether intentionally or unintentionally, I don't know if he accidentally misrepresented this or if he did it on purpose, but he said, hey, the Dobbs decision took it back to the states. It took it away from the federal government, took it away from the Congress, it took it away from DC. That is not true. That is not accurate. It's partially true. But what the Dobbs decision did was to say that there is no constitutional right to an abortion, meaning women don't have a right to kill their child in the womb because of the Constitution. They don't have that right. And it turned back the issue of abortion to the people's representatives, the people's legislative bodies. That's at the state level and the federal level. It meant that the states could limit abortion, but didn't have to. And it meant that the Congress or the federal level could limit abortion, but didn't have to. And it seemed like after the Dobbs decision 3 years ago, that nobody else was talking about abortion in DC all of a sudden. I felt very lonely on the issue. This is an issue that's been important to me since the mid-70s. I kind of came of age politically as a kid during the mid-70s when people like the great Dr. Jerry Falwell, founder of Liberty University, were on the forefront of fighting for life from conception, fighting against what was then the 1973 decision, Roe v. Wade. And I kind of came of age politically and sort of cut my teeth on political issues, on the life issue. It's always been terribly important to me and my wife. We have been advocates for life from conception, for pro-life policies, pro-life candidates, supporting crisis pregnancy centers in our hometowns and district and so forth. But it seemed like once the Dobbs decision came down and put this in the responsibility of Congress and the legislators across the country that very few in DC wanted to talk about it. Party leaders and the party as a whole certainly didn't want to talk about it and wasn't talking about abortion. The abortion issue was one reason, by the way, back in May of 23, that I endorsed Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, because Governor Ron DeSantis led the courageous action in Florida to pass a heartbeat bill, a 6-week heartbeat bill, at the same time that President Trump was calling abortion a settled issue on the federal level that shouldn't be dealt with in Washington. Governor DeSantis was taking on that issue courageously and principally in Florida. But in the 117th Congress, my first term, when Democrats had full control of government, I sponsored the Life at Conception Act. I was a co-sponsor, I should say. My friend Alex Mooney from West Virginia was the sponsor of that bill. And many Republicans at that time, when Democrats had full control of government before the Dobbs decision, many Republicans joined me in co-sponsoring, again, the Life at Conception Act. 167 Republicans were sponsors or co-sponsors of that bill, about 80% of Republicans in the House. And then I also initiated a discharge petition that first term, which, as you might be familiar with, a discharge petition is when if 218 legislators sign, 218 members of the House sign a petition to bring a bill to the floor, it can come to the floor without the help of the Speaker and the Majority Leader. It's a way to go around leadership. Now, we knew that was unlikely to prevail, obviously, in a Democrat House, but we had 130 Republicans sign that discharge petition. However, in the next Congress, in the 118th Congress, my second term after the Dobbs decision, we had far fewer Republicans, just a very small fraction, who were willing to sponsor the Life at Conception Act, or let alone to do a discharge petition. In my second term, one of my last bills before I left Washington was my life bill, and it was using the Commerce Clause, in particular the Constitutional Commerce Clause that empowers Congress from a constitutional power standpoint, where my bill would have made it a federal crime for a licensed medical practitioner who participates in interstate commerce, which is almost every medical practitioner, or accepts federal funds, which is almost every medical practitioner. It would make it illegal for them to prescribe or perform an abortion at any time after conception or fertilization. And it would have made that a criminal offense if they did that as a condition of accepting federal money, or they accepted federal health care programs. They couldn't use any federal funds to pay for an abortion. It prohibited federally regulated health plans. So a federally regulated health plan couldn't cover abortion. And it did have protection for the life of the mother, but it did not have protections for rape or incest, which I'll come back to. But abortion, or the life issue, is literally a life or death issue. The Roe v. Wade decision is the only decision, again, in the history of our country, it's the only Supreme Court decision that cost over 60 million lives over that 50-year period, or 49-year period from 1973 to 2022. Abortion today, though, remains the number one cause of death in this country. Let me say that again. Abortion today remains the number one cause of death in this country, and it's not even close. Number two is heart disease, with about 700,000 deaths a year. Number three is cancer, with about 600,000 deaths a year. And abortion is about the same number as the two of those combined. As a matter of fact, there were 1.1 abortions in 2024, the last year for which we have numbers. Abortion deaths even exceeded COVID deaths in this country in 2020 and 2021. And unlike heart disease and cancer, abortion deaths are totally preventable, 100% preventable. So this is a moral issue, obviously. It's not an economic or a financial issue, but it does impact our country economically and financially. When you have some 63 million lives that are not in this country, they're not living, they're not alive in this country. This is an economic issue with 63 million people who don't exist in our country that would exist if it wasn't for abortion. These are 63 million people, again, who've been aborted, innocent impression lives that were aborted since 1973, the Roe v. Wade decision. whose average age over the past 52 years would be 26 years old. So, you know, considering that roughly half the abortions would have taken place, by 26 years in, half of them 26 years after. So, in 52 years, half the people will be over 26, half the people will be under 26. So the average age about 26 years old for people who've been aborted in this country. That means they're not in our workforce. They're not paying into Social Security. That's part of the reason why Social Security is going bankrupt, by the way. That's part of the reason why we have a labor shortage in this country, by the way. And they're not contributing to our country and our society. They're not making us better and they're not making us stronger. These are people who are not teaching in our schools. They're not ministering in our churches and our faith-based organizations. They're not creating things, designing things. They're not inventing things. They're not defending our country, protecting our citizens and law enforcement, or any other noble, honorable profession. They're not farming. 63 million people are missing in our country because of the infamous Roe v. Wade decision from 1973. Overturned by the Dobbs decision in 2022, but the Dobbs decision, of course, did not outlaw abortion. It did not prohibit abortion. It simply said that legislators could prohibit it. But abortions, sadly, have been increasing since the Dobbs decision. There were more abortions in 2024 than there were in 2023. Again, 1.14 million, 1.14 million or 1,140,000 in 2024, far and away the leading cause of death in our country. And it's equally concerning that some 60% of those abortions are now what are called chemical abortions, or through the abortion pill, or at-home abortions. They represent about 60% of abortions now. And like with the COVID vax, those who are using the abortion pill are not being informed about the risks and the complications that can result to it, the risks that are there for the mothers who are having these chemical abortions, these abortion pill abortions, risks that include loss of fertility, infection, dangerous hemorrhages, ruptured ectopic pregnancies, other serious health injuries, and even death. As a matter of fact, an at-home abortion, a chemical abortion, an abortion by pill, is 4 times riskier than a traditional abortion in the doctor's office for the mother. And of course, at-home abortions, like traditional abortions, are 100% fatal to the innocent, precious, preborn child. I also sponsored, by the way, in my first term in Congress, the Tele-Abortion Prevention Act. The Tele-Abortion Prevention Act, which would have made it a criminal offense for a medical practitioner to prescribe a chemical abortion without examining the mother, the patient, in the office before prescribing. Number 2, being present during the abortion procedure to help the mother with any complications. And number 3, to schedule a follow-up visit to ensure her recovery from this terrible procedure. So that was just a way to try to address the explosion of chemical abortion or at-home pill abortions. But my question for Republicans is, why do we buy into or accept the narrative of the Democrats and the media? But I know I'm redundant there, the Democrats and the media. But why do Republicans accept the narrative of the Democrats and the media when it comes to abortion? Most voters are not single issue pro-abortion voters. Most voters are not single issue pro-abortion voters, of course. Some 20% or so in most polls are hard pro-abortion with no limits voters. That's the Democrat position. Pro-abortion with no limits on abortion. Only about 20% of the electorate is voting that way, similar to the numbers that are the hard pro-life from conception on the right. That's where my wife and I are, hard pro-life from conception on the right. That's about 20% of voters, and about 20% of voters are, again, hard Democrat position of no restrictions on abortion at any time for any reason. But we're not going to get those max abortion voters anyway, those ones who want more abortions, and that's their number one issue. We're not going to get those as Republicans. So Republicans need to go on offense on this issue, not apologize for it, not hide from it, but go on offense and attack the Democrats' extreme position. Again, the Democrat position on abortion is abortion at any time, for any reason, up to the moment of birth, with no restrictions, with no limitations. Republicans ought to be, again, unapologetically, unashamedly pro-life from conception. It's the right position. And Democrats are going to accuse you of trying to ban abortion anyway, regardless of what your limits that you might believe in or that you might take as a pragmatic Republican politician. Democrats are going to accuse you of trying to ban abortion no matter what restrictions or limits you might believe in. So we shouldn't be getting on the slippery slope of timelines and negotiating the timeline for abortion, when we think it's okay at this many weeks or that many weeks and are in these conditions or those conditions. The only principled position is life from conception. The science of life is settled. We know it begins at conception. It's not even really seriously debated anymore. So again, we shouldn't be in the business of negotiating the timeline of when we think abortion is okay. We ought to be against all abortion. We ought to be in favor of protecting all innocent, precious life in the womb. That said, I would and vote for any restrictions on abortion. If you believe in saving every innocent, precious life, then any abortion restrictions that didn't go as far as I wanted to go, I would still vote for those because I want to limit those abortions and keep fighting for life from conception. But there are some lessons on this issue politically. It's a moral issue, and I understand it's also a political issue. But there's some lessons on this issue from Virginia in recent elections, statewide elections. In 2021, 4 years ago, and of course we've got big Virginia elections for the state legislature this year, as well as gubernatorials, lieutenant governor, and attorney general elections. But so we're in 2021, the last time we had a governor's election in Virginia, the Democrats tried to make the issue all about abortion. It was on the eve of the Dobbs decision, some 6-7 months before the Dobbs decision. We knew the Supreme Court was soon going to rule on abortion. The Democrats made the election all about abortion in what was and is a purple, blue-leaning state. And we won, the Republicans won both houses of the state legislature and won the governor's mansion and the state lieutenant governor and the attorney general when Democrats made that the issue all about abortion. However, in 2023, 2 years later, in the midterm elections here in Virginia, in the state legislature, Republicans really compromised on the abortion issue. Governor Youngkin disappointingly came out he said, I'd like to have a 15-week abortion ban, but I'll take a 20-week abortion ban. He literally said that he wanted a 15-week abortion ban, but he would take a 20-week abortion ban. Of course, Democrats ran with that and said, Governor Youngkin's trying to ban all abortions. So he was attacked for doing that anyway. But 95% of abortions take place before 15 weeks, and 99% of abortions take place before 20 weeks. Now, I said at the time, you don't want to play poker, or maybe you do want to play poker with the Republicans because you don't come out and say, my position is 15 weeks, but I'll take 20 weeks if that's all I can get. And that means your starting point is 20 weeks, obviously a ridiculous negotiating ploy. But what essentially Republicans were saying with that position was, hey, Democrats are for all abortions, 100% of abortions, but we'll take a 20-week ban. We're only for 99% of abortions because only 1% of abortions take place after 20 weeks. And again, the Democrats ran ads saying that we wanted to ban abortion, that Republicans wanted to ban abortions. I held a life from conception rally during that campaign just to try to bring attention to the issue and to encourage Republicans to stand and fight for life at conception. I could only get one state legislator to show up. I was in Congress at the time, but to show up and support that rally, and that was David LaRock, former state delegate. So Republicans compromised their principles, and the Democrats ran ads saying they wanted to ban all abortion, and then the Republicans lost anyway. So what did they get for that? They didn't win politically. They certainly didn't win morally. So Republicans too often on this issue, they're compromised, lacking in courage, lacking in conviction on what, again, is a life and death issue that should be fundamental to who we are as a country and as a party, as Republicans. Republicans, they want to win on the issue, and Democrats want more abortions. And Republicans, again, buy into the false narrative from the Democrats and the media that, hey, you got to compromise on abortion if you want to win. You've even got Republicans in D.C. who don't want to defund Planned Parenthood. In the big bill that just passed, President Trump's big bill, there was reduction in funding for Planned Parenthood. Not all funding was eliminated, but some funding was eliminated, and in Medicaid at least. And you've got Republicans in Washington right now in the House and the Senate fighting to restore funding for Planned Parenthood. And again, the bill as it stands now didn't even eliminate all funding for Planned Parenthood. It just eliminated the Medicaid portion. There are still other funding for Planned Parenthood that's in the federal budget. But Planned Parenthood is an organization that began in the eugenics movement, targeting minorities and disabled or challenged, physically or mentally challenged Americans. And it's incredible that Republicans would be fighting to keep and to even restore funding for Planned Parenthood. Democrats, they are consistent on the issue. Again, no restrictions for any reason, up into the moment of birth, and you get to pay for it with your tax dollars, for your tax dollars going to Planned Parenthood, or your tax dollars providing for abortion for federal employees, military, the Democrat position. And they don't tolerate any variation from their position. The Democrats, you might have some elected Democrats privately tell you that they believe in some restrictions on abortion, but I challenge you to find me one elected Democrat on the state or federal level who in writing or in speeches or interviews or remarks or on their website supports any restrictions on abortion. There's your homework assignment. Find me one Democrat elected at the state or the federal level that supports publicly any restrictions on abortions. But that said about the political issue, aren't some things bigger than the next election? Don't some things transcend politics? Again, is anything sacred and worth fighting for Republicans? Is anything non-negotiable? Our position on life ought to be that. We ought to be willing to stand unapologetically, unequivocally, uncompromisingly for life from conception and refuse to compromise on that as we try to change people's hearts and minds and as we try to win elections, because the American people are with us on the overwhelming majority of the other issues. The Democrats are wrong on every issue, not just wrong on abortion. But as we fight to change hearts and minds on abortion, we should stand strong as the people's elected representatives, elected officials on this issue. Remember, slavery was legal at one time too in this country. And we, the Republicans, are the party of emancipation, the party of ending slavery. And as slavery was the national scourge, the stain on our history from the 17 and 1800s, may abortion be that scourge or that stain in our history from the 1900s and the 2000s. And may one day we look on abortion supporters the same way we look on slavery supporters, with disdain for how wrong they were on that issue and how contrary their positions were to our founding principles. The fact is, the Republican Party is the party of civil rights for all in the 1960s, 100 years after being the party for equality and against slavery in the 1860s. We're the party for codifying into law the founding principles from our founding documents, our Declaration of Independence, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, meaning God put them within the heart and the minds of people naturally, natural law. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with the right to life. That's the first one. So we ought to be the party about that these truths that are self-evident, that we're all created equal, that we're all endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, but life being that first one. Ours must be a society, a culture, a country that values life. We must retain our founding principles, which begin with the right to life. Of course, it's a biblical principle as well. The Bible speaks about how God creates us in his image, forms us in the womb, has a purpose for us from the womb, from when he delicately designs and creates us and puts us together. So it's a biblical principle as well. All of us know of people who found themselves, mothers who found themselves in difficult, unplanned pregnancies in the worst of circumstances. But there's never a situation where killing the innocent child makes things better. It certainly doesn't make things better for the child who didn't ask to be conceived under those circumstances. It doesn't make things better for the mother who has to carry that decision for the rest of her life. I've never met anyone who came out of a difficult pregnancy situation and wished that their mother had aborted them. But like I suspect many of you, I know people who are supremely glad that their mother chose life. One of those is a gentleman named Ryan Baumberger, who I invited during my time in Congress to be my guest at the State of the Union. He's with the Radiance Foundation. You can look him up at radiancefoundation.org. Again, Ryan Baumberger. His mother was raped and he was conceived in just a terrible circumstance. But thankfully, she chose life. And now he's a father, he's got children, he's contributing to our country and our society, he's fighting for the sanctity of life, and he's become a friend of mine. It was Ronald Reagan who famously said that I've noticed that everyone who's for abortion has already been born. Again, Ronald Reagan said, I've noticed that everyone who's for abortion has already been born. You know, the proverbial fallback default position of Democrats and the liberal media is, well, what about rape, incest, and health of the mother or life of the mother? That's a distraction, quite frankly. It accounts for less than 1% of all abortions. As a matter of fact, life of the mother, as opposed to health of the mother, is an almost non-existent issue. The fact is 99% of abortions are convenience abortions, meaning it's unplanned, unwanted pregnancy. It's not the right time. The mom doesn't want to have the baby for whatever reason. It's a difficult situation. But when you deliver a baby early to try to save life, whether to save the baby's life or save the mother's life, that is not an abortion. So again, this issue of rape, incest, life of the mother, it's really a distraction because some 99% of abortions are convenience abortions. For that matter, I would just pose the question, what does make abortion wrong or some abortion wrong? Meaning those who are sort of not the 20% that they want more abortions with no restrictions, no limits, like all the Democrat elected people, or the 20% or so who are like me that believe in life from conception with no exceptions. Those who are in that middle range, that 60% or so in the middle that have some degree of restrictions, what makes abortion wrong under any circumstances? What makes abortion wrong under any circumstances? And if it's wrong under some circumstances, isn't that what makes it wrong generally or more broadly? If it's merely a medical procedure removing fetal tissue, then you might hold, well, then it should be okay at any time for any reason. But no, the fact, the truth is that it's taken an innocent, precious life, and the right to life for that child should trump everything else. If you think that abortion is fine and there's nothing wrong with it, then I guess the consistent thing would be you believe in sex selection abortion like they practice in China, where if the unborn baby is a girl, then they'll have an abortion because they want a male child under the former now one-child policy in China. My point in there is that all abortion is wrong because it's the taking of an innocent, precious life, and that which makes abortion wrong in some circumstances is exactly what makes it wrong in all circumstances. I do want to point out that most sadly, the battle as it rages in our nation's capital for life and against abortion, or should be raging, I should say, many of the life groups, it's kind of like political groups generally in Washington, the life groups that you are most familiar with, most of them are really incremental frauds. They are frauds where they're not really fighting principally, uncompromisingly for life from conception. It seems so many of the life groups that their main purpose is to fundraise, to preserve their organization, to have access to power in the Republican side. That's reflected in the scorecards they give, where they'll protect moderate Republicans with their scorecards and the votes that they support or the votes they don't take positions on and don't score. They help Republican leadership provide cover for moderate Republicans. It's very sad to watch. And I found that as the most outspoken pro-life from conception member of Congress, I was seldom invited to the events and given speaking opportunities at the events for these so-called pro-life groups. And what they would do is they didn't tend to include the principled, consistent life from conception fighters. They would tend to invite the moderates who believed in born alive protection, or they believed in partial birth abortion protection, or 20-week bans or 15-week bans and things like that. One notable exception, the Students for Life and their president, Kristen Hawkins, they were a great help to me during my time in Washington 4 years. They were a staunch pro-life from conception ally. You can follow them at studentsforlife.org. But Republican leadership is also the problem because they protect moderates on this issue. And Republican leadership, the speaker, the majority leader, they prevent most pro-life legislation from coming to the floor for a vote. They generally will say, oh, we can have one really modest life vote per year, or maybe even per term, on the floor, and it would be some kind of benign, vanilla, like federal funding for abortion, or born alive, um, or partial birth abortion, or some really weak restriction. But we cannot turn a blind eye to this issue or go silent on this issue as a movement, as conservatives, and even as Republicans. This is an issue, the abortion issue, that will claim 3,100 innocent lives today. 3,100 abortions are performed every day in this country. All of them totally preventable loss of life. I'm encouraged by the pro-life generation. That's high school and college students today. The polls show that the young people are the most pro-life segment of our culture, of our society, and that's really encouraging. They're the ones turning out for the marches for life around the country and in Washington. They know that life begins at conception. They've seen it with their younger brothers and sisters with the ultrasounds. So we've got to go on offense against the extreme Democrat position as we work to change hearts and minds across this country and speak out and advocate for the issue of life, debate it, engage on it. Support your local crisis pregnancy centers and at-risk mothers who come to those pregnancy centers knowing that abortion's wrong, but feeling like they have no options and no hope and they don't know what to do. Support those crisis pregnancy centers. We want to reduce unwanted and unplanned pregnancies by supporting morality and marriage and fidelity within marriage. Of course, again, if you support morality, sex within the boundaries of marriage as God intended, and getting married and staying married and being faithful in your marriage, you can have a whole lot fewer unwanted, unplanned pregnancies in this country. Pastors and churches have a role to play also. They've got to have courage. They've got to speak out and stand up and be counted on this all-important issue, take positions for and against candidates and elected officials who fight and stand for truth on abortion and stand for the sanctity of life. And we've got to demand the same from our candidates and our elected officials on the Republican side. This is foundational to keeping the republic we've been entrusted, where it was established on the principles that that we are endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights, and among these are life being the first one. So thanks for joining me on this episode of the Good for America podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I want to ask you again to subscribe to the podcast, follow me on social media at Brett Bob Good, rate the show, and share it with your friends. Let's keep the republic.